May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A few years ago, I was sitting at the dinner table and my son said the most random thing that I could at that point imagine. He said, "Do you think Jesus is part basilisk?" And I thought for a moment, and I had no idea how to respond because I had no idea what a basilisk was. And so I went online and I discovered that a basilisk is this little reptile that you find in Central and South America, which is, and I don't know if he knew this, but it's actually nicknamed the Jesus Christ lizard. And if you were to go online and you were to look up basilisk and just go to videos, you would see images there and videos that you could not get out of your head of this little reptile literally running on top of the surface of the water. And so this is one of nature's wonderful, wonderful gifts, is this little reptile that can run on water. And so the question made so much sense later. Do you think Jesus is part basilisk? That's a great theory. We have this morning an iconic story in Scripture, and it's a Sunday school favorite. If you grew up in church, then you know this well. Jesus comes to his disciples walking on water. They're being thrown around by a storm. They're all in a boat, and then Peter, they think it's a ghost. Peter looks and says, "Jesus, if it's you, command me to come to you on water." And so Jesus says, "Come," and Peter gets out of the water, and he himself walks on water until he becomes afraid and distracted by the winds, and then he starts to sink, and he yells out, and Jesus reaches out and grabs his hand and pulls him up again. It's such a wonderful story, and there's so many different directions to take a story like this in, but what I want to do today, I want to do something different with this story. I want to talk about a storm, but I don't want to talk about the storm that's in this story. And I want to talk about stepping out in faith, but it's not Peter's faith of stepping out of the boat that I want to talk about. You see, there's actually another storm that is raging in this story, and it's one that we never talk about. You see, this story takes place in Matthew chapter 14. If you were to go to the beginning of this chapter, the story that starts this chapter is the story of John the Baptist actually being killed by King Herod Agrippa. And so the story that we know is John was a prophet, and he had said a few things to the king that the king did not appreciate, so the king had imprisoned him. And at some point in time, you can read the story, the king decides to behead John. And so John is beheaded, and so he is taken by his disciples and he's buried. And what we're told at the end of that section is that after his disciples buried him, they went and they told Jesus. Okay, so this is really important because the very next thing that happens is the passage that we heard last Sunday. And the way that passage starts is that Jesus, once he learns of what happened to John the Baptist, it says he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So Jesus finds out that John the Baptist is beheaded, and he withdraws in a boat to a deserted place by himself. And what's really important for us to realize here is that this behavior on Jesus' part is very natural for someone who is grieving and who is mourning for the loss of not only a family member, we know John is his cousin, but a mentor in the faith. John was preaching for years before Jesus came on started his ministry, and John the Baptist is the one who baptized Jesus. But there's even, I think, another level to this major loss for Jesus, is that, I'll just tell you a story and I'll connect it. A few years ago, we had some people from Walter Reed, wounded warriors come to St. John's to speak about their experience of re-entry. And one of the things that stands out I'll never forget this in my mind, is how these wounded warriors talked about how difficult it was for them to identify with anyone else that hadn't actually been in battle, any other veterans who had actually had active duty. And so this difference that an experience like that's so intense, like being in the military and being a part of a war, how that separates you from the rest of the world who has no idea what an experience like that is. And so here they were talking about brotherhood and the sense of connection to other veterans. And I think about how for John and Jesus, from the very start, their paths were intertwined. How there aren't really many who understood what Jesus's ministry and calling entailed. And I can imagine for Jesus in his life, always knowing that there's someone else out there who really understands what it's like to be a prophet who is marginalized. And so John the Baptist all of a sudden is gone. So Jesus is grieving this significant loss. He's battling a storm. He's in a dark place. So what does he do? He turns inward. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Now, I got to tell you, I can't help but feel the immense relatability of this event in Jesus's life to our own experience of pain and suffering and grief and loss in our own lives. I mean, you've experienced it. I've experienced it. These moments in life that feel like the rug has just been pulled out from under you. An accident, a death, an illness or a diagnosis, just the way it turns your world upside down. A layoff, loss of income, a breakup, a pandemic. So these moments in life where it just feels like everything just changes. And where, like Jesus, our natural tendency is to just turn inward and to figure out how to take care of ourselves. He withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Now listen to what happens. Again, this is the passage we heard last Sunday. So Jesus withdraws by himself, and the crowds were told, see where he's going, and they on foot, on land, they follow. And so where Jesus ends up landing on the shore, he looks up and there is this massive, massive crowd. And what we know by the numbers that are expressed in the story, we're looking at maybe 15 to 20,000 people. So we're not talking like a small crowd. So you have to just imagine Jesus' reaction as he sees this crowd and wanting to be alone. But anyway, he walks up on the shore and he sees them, and so he decides to spend some time with them. He heals their sick, and then the disciples catch up and they look around and they say, look, Jesus, it's getting late. We should probably feed the crowd. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And that's how we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Again, it says 5,000 men besides women and children. You got to love that patriarchal kind of a commentary. But when we think about just culturally, if it's 5,000 men, then their families are with them. So we're looking at maybe 15 or 20,000 people whom Jesus fed that day. So that's the story we heard last Sunday. Now, the next thing that happens is the story we read this morning. And listen to the language here. Jesus feeds the 5,000, and it says immediately he instructs the disciples to get in the boat and go on ahead of him. And unless you know the background, why is Jesus so eager to get the disciples away from him? So when we kind of think about Jesus's interrupted grief and mourning process, he tells the disciples, go ahead of me, and he dismisses the crowd, and he goes up to a mountain to pray by himself. Meanwhile, the disciples are now on the Sea of Galilee, and it's just a little while later, maybe an hour or two, that the storm starts to rage, and Jesus looks down from the mountain and he sees his poor disciples unable to handle the storm. Now, you just have to wonder if Jesus was like, are you kidding me? Right? Can I just get a couple of hours, maybe a day to myself to just think about this huge thing that's going on in my life with the loss of John the Baptist? Isn't it so true that life is not always very accommodating of our storms? We want life to stop for a moment just so that we can regroup, just collect ourselves. We don't want to be needed. We don't want anything to be expected of us just for a little bit so that we can get away and just deal with the storm that's raging within us. It's nearly impossible, I find, to focus on other things when you are trying to survive. And yet life goes on. You still have to pay the rent. Your kids still need a parent. Other storms, challenges, situations arise that need your attention. And here we have these two situations. Jesus has to decide, how am I going to respond? And one thing he could do is he could say, sorry, guys, it's not a good day for me. He could have landed on the beach and said, I know everyone showed up. Thanks so much for walking. It's not a good time for me. Or he could have looked and seen the disciples. By the way, it doesn't say storm. It just says the wind were really strong and the disciples were having a hard time rowing to shore. I think it really would have been understandable for Jesus to say, guys, you're going to have to figure this one out on your own. But there's really interesting language here. Jesus doesn't just say, I'm sorry, I can't help you today. What happens is when he sees the crowds, it says he has compassion for them. And then when he sees the disciples struggling at the oars, he says, do not be afraid, it's me. And you just kind of get the sense that Jesus is, in both situations, actually moved to action. There's something about these other storms around him, these struggles and challenges that others are facing that somehow moves him, even as he finds himself dealing with his own grief. Now, as I was preparing the sermon, I wanted to make sure that we did not hear that this is about being heroic, right? And psychology says this, it is imperative for us to take space and time to grieve. So this is not just saying, look, it's okay if you grieve. If other people need something, you just kind of go and help them. That's not what this sermon is about. It's not about being heroic. What I'm seeing in this passage and I want to draw our attention to is a shift in perspective. That our storms in life, if we allow them, as we're kind of seeing that Jesus allowed them, can be powerful spiritual agents that they have the ability to actually help us tap into a deeper well of compassion. I don't know if you've noticed this in your own life where you've gone through something difficult and it starts to dawn on you, this is what it must be like. We have a few parishioners who've lost parents recently. And I even, as I listen to these stories and some have shared with me, I've heard others who've lost parents have never really known what it was like, but now I can say this is what it must be like. And it's just a deeper access to compassion and relatability to others. I'm going to tell you in a moment a way that I feel we as a church have had our well of compassion deepened. But I just want to pause here and say, is it a coincidence that two of the most iconic stories in the Gospels take place in the midst of this space of grief and loss for Jesus? The story of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. I think it speaks of the power of serving from a place of vulnerability. So much of our serving sometimes happens top down, and yet this is a real incarnational way of coming at service, not top down by side, not because we think you need help, but because we understand what it's like to be in the storm and we're reaching out with compassion. Now, I want to say I started my sermon today talking about the Jesus Christ lizard. And I want to say that I think that there are other ways that we can coin or talk about the Jesus Christ quality. Maybe none of us can walk on water, but we can definitely say that there are pieces of Jesus Christ and his life and ministry that we can adopt and say we are a Jesus Christ church. And I want to tell you, as I was writing the sermon and as we are about in a little bit to enter into our annual parish meeting, thinking about this past year and this really significant storm that we've been in as a culture and as a church, COVID. I want to just reflect with you for a moment about the option that we have anytime when we're in a storm to just turn inward. And as a church, we could have just turned inward. And we kind of did this for a little bit of saying, how are we going to survive meeting together? But really soon after COVID started, I'm talking within a week, when things shut down for us, we started to see within our church community this really compelling, moving power of compassion in the midst of our own storms. So we're in the storm and yet looking at others and saying, how can we also be there for others in the midst of their storm? Not from a space of obligation, but a place of really empathy and deep connection. I was at my gym the other day, and I started a conversation with this other person who I've known for like 3 years, but I've never really chatted with her. And I found out that she works out with me in the gym, but she's a firefighter across the street from us right here at St. John's on the corner of Bradley and Wisconsin. And I said to her, do you know that I'm the priest at the church across the street from you? And there was this moment of like, wow, like our worlds are so close, but we just didn't even know. And she said, wait, you guys are the church that's bringing us snacks every now and then. You guys like do good things for us. And and this was pre-COVID. This is like things that our youth are doing when they pack snacks. We have this wonderful practice that our church school teachers started called Sundays of Service. And we've done that a couple of times. And I was like, yes. And I took so much pride in that. But I'm sharing that with you because before COVID, there were a few who knew us because of our service. But I can say now, after COVID, it's like the whole community is aware of St. John's as a community that cares for the community. Since COVID started, and I really want you to hear this as a part of my comments for the annual parish meeting, we had this incredible effort called Help the Helpers that was spearheaded by our own men's ministry of delivering meals, making and delivering masks, hand sanitizer, and other hygiene products. And the beneficiaries of this in our local community were hospital emergency personnel, the BCC Rescue Squad and Montgomery County Police benefiting from these services that we were offering in love and compassion. Montgomery Hospice, the YMCA Airlawn Child Care Program, the COVID-stricken communities who are up county, who really are experiencing a lot of just pain and loss right now. Ride-on bus drivers. I think we provided hand sanitizer to like 150 ride-on bus drivers. So all of this was happening in the midst of our own storm. And this work is now evolving into new projects, and I want to share one with you, and then I'll close. So what is happening right now with all this growth and this movement around caring for the community is a care for hunger in our local community and to address food insecurity. And there have been two incredible opportunities that have come up that are now we're facing and we're really excited to be a part of as a community, as a church community. The first one is called Here to Help. This was actually started by a high school senior at BCC. And it's a nonprofit help aimed at bringing food into the homes of people who are experiencing food insecurity. The other one is a partnership with Nourish Now, which is an established nonprofit food provider. And it's to establish, and they want to work with St. John's to establish a first-time family relief food distribution program in Bethesda, and we are helping start this. And since we started this conversation, there have been three others who have joined us. The BCC Rescue Squad is a part of this initiative now. The Greater Bethesda Chamber of Commerce is a part of it, and also Hyatt Regency. So we are moving with others and helping to spearhead these beautiful activities in our local community that really make a difference out of the space of our own storm. And over the next 6 months, we'll be providing nearly 20,000 meals to people in our own community. And so I want to just conclude today by sharing again this beautiful shift in perspective. What's the storm that you're going through? I know for some of us, COVID is like the max, but I know there are other storms that we're going through in our own lives. And I'm curious for you, what is it that you are going through? That you're having a hard time focusing on other things because that's what you're managing right now. What's your loss? What's your grief? What's your challenge or your adversity? And the shift is simply this. It could be a time to just say, I need to take care of myself. I don't need anybody bothering me. But it could also be a shift where we say, this storm for me, if I allow it to be, can actually be a really powerful spiritual agent in helping me tap into an even deeper well of compassion. And not from a space of obligation or guilt, but just from a space of compassion, looking around and saying, who else might be going through what I'm going through? Amen.